In this episode, we focus on a mindset shift that turns a Linux system from something you merely operate into something you actively protect. And that shift is learning to treat accounts as security boundaries rather than as personal conveniences. New learners often start out thinking of accounts as just names and passwords, and then they discover that accounts are really collections of permissions, habits, and assumptions about what a person or process is allowed to do. When those assumptions are wrong, the results can be dramatic, because a single careless habit can make a small mistake permanent or can give an attacker a wider runway than they should have. The good news is that you do not need complex tools to get safer behavior, because many of the most effective controls are simple guardrails that make dangerous actions harder to do by accident and easier to trace when they do happen. We are going to talk about restricted shells, why avoiding root habits matters, and what practical guardrails look like in a beginner-friendly Linux environment. The goal is not to turn you into a paranoid administrator, but to help you build safe defaults so the system works with you instead of quietly waiting for you to slip. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to start is to clarify what the root account represents, because people often misunderstand the danger by thinking the risk is only about malicious actions. Root is a super-user identity with broad power to change system configuration, modify any file, stop services, and override many protections, and that power is necessary for certain tasks. The danger is that root also removes most of the friction that would normally stop a mistake, so a small typo can become a system-wide outage or a data loss event. This is why experienced administrators try to spend most of their time as a normal user and elevate privileges only when needed, because the normal user context acts like a safety rail. Another reason is accountability, because using personal accounts for work and elevating in a controlled way ties actions to individuals rather than to a shared identity. When you get used to operating safely without living as root, you are practicing least privilege, which reduces damage from both accidents and compromises. That habit is one of the simplest, most powerful security improvements you can make on any Linux system. Avoiding root habits is also about reducing credential risk, because root credentials are high-value targets. If many people know a root password, it spreads quickly and becomes impossible to track who used it. If root login is enabled for remote access, attackers will focus on it because the reward is maximum privilege if they succeed. If you instead require people to log in as themselves and then elevate for specific actions, you reduce the number of times a highly privileged credential must be used, and you increase the visibility of privileged actions. Even in a small environment, this matters because accidents and compromises do not care whether the system is important, they only care whether the system is exposed and whether the controls are weak. Beginners sometimes think they can be casual in a lab, but habits built in a lab become habits in real environments, so it is worth practicing safe patterns early. The best guardrails are the ones that make the safer path the easiest path. Restricted shells fit into this story as a way to limit what an account can do interactively, especially for accounts that should not have full general-purpose access. A shell is the interface that interprets user input and launches programs, and a normal shell gives a user enormous freedom to explore the file system, run tools, and chain actions together. That freedom is useful for administrators, but it can be dangerous for accounts that are meant to do only one thing, like a service account or an account used for a specific file transfer task. A restricted shell is designed to limit certain capabilities, such as changing directories, running commands outside of a permitted set, or modifying environment settings that could be used to escape restrictions. The purpose is to reduce the risk that someone uses the account as a general foothold to explore the system. It is not perfect, because clever attackers may still find ways around weak restrictions, but as a guardrail it can reduce accidental misuse and raise the effort required for abuse. To understand restricted shells at a conceptual level, think in terms of intent and boundaries rather than in terms of exact configuration. If an account is meant to perform a single function, like launching one program or operating within one directory, then giving that account a full interactive shell is like giving a visitor a master key because they need access to one room. A safer approach is to constrain what the account can do to match the function. That constraint can be done by using a restricted shell, by forcing a specific command on login, or by using file and directory permissions to keep the account inside a narrow part of the file system. The important beginner insight is that restrictions should be layered, because any single mechanism can be bypassed if it is the only barrier. When you layer restrictions, such as limiting the shell, limiting directory access, and limiting privilege permissions, you create defense in depth. Even if one layer is weak, the other layers can still prevent a minor issue from turning into full system compromise. Another major guardrail is to distinguish human accounts from service accounts, because their security needs are different. Human accounts are used by people, so they need authentication controls, clear ownership, and limits on privilege. Service accounts are used by programs, so they should be as minimal as possible, often without interactive login, and restricted to the files and resources required for the service. Many security incidents begin when a service account is granted too much access, either because it was easier or because no one wanted to debug permission issues properly. If that service account is compromised, the attacker inherits all of its permissions, which can include access to sensitive data or the ability to modify system state. A safer pattern is to create service accounts with no interactive shell and with carefully scoped access to only the directories and resources required. That reduces the chances that the account can be used as a general-purpose entry point, and it also reduces the damage the account can do if exploited. Practical guardrails also include reducing the number of accounts that can become privileged at all, because privilege should be an exception, not a default. Instead of giving broad elevation capability to everyone, you assign it to a small set of trusted roles, and you keep that set small enough to review and manage. The core idea is that every privileged account expands the attack surface, because attackers only need one success. When you keep privileged paths limited, you also reduce the chance that someone will accidentally run a destructive action simply because they could. In a learning environment, it can feel convenient to give yourself broad privilege all the time, but that teaches the wrong instinct. The better instinct is to ask, do I truly need elevated power for this task? And if so, can I limit it to the specific action and time? That instinct will serve you far beyond the exam, because it aligns with how real environments balance operational needs with security. Guardrails are also about making dangerous actions harder to perform casually, which can be done through policy and through friction in the right places. Requiring re-authentication before privilege elevation, limiting the duration of elevated sessions, and ensuring privileged actions are logged are all examples of friction that supports safety. This is not friction for its own sake, but friction that forces the user to slow down and be intentional at the moment they are about to cross a boundary. In the same way, limiting remote root login and enforcing secure authentication methods adds friction to attackers while still allowing legitimate access. Another guardrail is ensuring that accounts lock or expire appropriately, which reduces the risk of forgotten accounts becoming silent entry points. These ideas connect directly to password policy and lockout concepts, because authentication controls and account lifecycle controls are part of the same overall boundary management. When you see guardrails as deliberate boundary controls, they stop feeling like random rules and start feeling like a coherent system. It is also important to recognize the human habit patterns that create risk, because many account safety issues are behavioral. One habit is using root for routine browsing and exploration, which increases the chance of accidental modification. Another habit is using the same account for multiple purposes, such as using an administrative account for email reading or web browsing, which increases exposure to phishing and malware. Another habit is sharing accounts, which destroys accountability and makes it impossible to manage access cleanly. A safer habit is to have separate accounts for separate roles, such as a normal daily account and a controlled elevation path for administrative actions, and to keep remote access pathways minimal. Even when you are the only person on a system, these separations reduce the chance that an accident becomes catastrophic. Training yourself to follow these habits is part of becoming competent at Linux security, because the system can enforce rules, but it cannot prevent every human mistake without your cooperation. Restricted shells and account guardrails also interact with monitoring and auditing because safe systems assume that something will go wrong and they prepare to detect it. If an account is supposed to do one thing, then activity outside that one thing is suspicious and should stand out. If privileged actions are logged and tied to individual accounts, then investigations become faster and more accurate. If service accounts cannot log in interactively, then any interactive login attempt using that identity is immediately suspicious. These are examples of how good boundaries create good signals, and good signals make security response practical. Beginners sometimes focus only on prevention, but detection and accountability are what allows systems to be defended over time. In other words, guardrails are not only about stopping bad things, but also about making bad things obvious when they happen. A common misconception is that restricted shells are a complete solution to account safety, but they are better seen as one tool among several. If a restricted shell is the only boundary and the account still has broad file permissions, an attacker may not need a full shell to cause harm. Conversely, if file permissions and service design already limit what the account can access, the restricted shell becomes an extra layer that reduces interactive misuse. Another misconception is that avoiding root is a matter of preference, as if experienced administrators simply like typing more. In reality, avoiding root is about reducing risk, increasing accountability, and preventing small mistakes from turning into large disasters. The most secure systems are usually built from many small, boring decisions that collectively reduce attack surface and reduce blast radius. When you learn to respect these small decisions, you begin to think like a defender rather than like someone trying to get around the system quickly. To troubleshoot account and access issues at a conceptual level, you again return to intent and boundaries. If a user cannot perform an action, first ask whether the account should be able to do it at all, because sometimes the issue is that the expectation is wrong. If the account should be able to do it, then ask whether the permission boundary is being enforced by file permissions, group membership, a restricted shell constraint, or a privilege elevation rule. If an account is unexpectedly able to do something dangerous, ask whether it has been granted broader group membership, whether it can elevate privileges, or whether a shared directory or service account has too much access. The goal is not to remove boundaries, but to align boundaries with the role the account is supposed to serve. When you think this way, you can adjust access safely without turning every fix into a new security hole. This kind of reasoning is exactly what the Linux Plus exam rewards, because it is testing whether you understand the purpose of the controls, not just whether you can name them. By bringing everything together, safer accounts in Linux are about designing identities that match roles, limiting interactive capabilities where they are not needed, and resisting the temptation to live as root just because it feels easier. Restricted shells are a way to narrow what an account can do in an interactive session, especially for accounts that should not act like full users. Avoiding root habits reduces both accident risk and compromise impact, because it keeps powerful actions deliberate and logged instead of casual and invisible. Practical guardrails include limiting who can elevate privileges, disabling unnecessary interactive access for service accounts, reducing shared credentials, and using authentication and monitoring controls that make misuse harder and more visible. When you approach accounts as boundaries and guardrails as system design choices, you gain a stable way to think about Linux security that carries across many topics, from permissions to remote access to incident response. That stable thinking will help you answer exam questions confidently and will also help you build Linux systems that remain reliable and defensible over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.